Hey, so we're going to do some cooking without measuring. We're going to start with the basic dough that we used to bake bread. So we'll start with adding warm water to a bowl with yeast. We'll put in some agave syrup, but you could use honey or any kind of sugar. I use a little bit of gluten because I like that, and white flour. And then I'll stir it up with either a whisk or a paddle using no metal tarts. So I'll take about, I don't know, that much yeast. This is a cup and a half, maybe 2 cups of warm water. So I'm going to wake up that yeast. I'm going to squirt in some agave syrup to start feeding it. And I like putting a little gluten in. Gluten in, how much? I don't know, that much. I don't really obviously measure. And we're going to proof this. I'll add just a little bit of flour, stir it around a little bit, and see if I can get some of those bubbles forming. So I'll stir this. It would be nice to whisk it. I think I'm going to guess about 4 cups, but ooh, there we go. And it might get a little sticky. There was a big clump that fell out there. But that's okay. This recipe is so robust that, you could make it work with whatever. More. I can always, if it gets too thin, I can always add more flour too. I'm also going to add a scrambled egg this time. There's my scrambled egg. And maybe this is enough so I can shake this off of this. I got a beep going on in the background. Because what I was doing was melting a little butter. Here you go. Melting a little butter. And we don't want butter too hot because it'll kill the yeast. So it's melted, but it's cooling down a little bit, so it'll still stay liquid. I'm going to add a little bit here in a bit. Instead of the olive oil, I add a little bit of butter. Let me test it. It's not hot at all. A little bit there, and just keep stirring it. And then I'm going to want to knead it, just like I did before. Basic white bread recipe. I don't want to add too much here. Here we go. It's kind of, again, it's really hard to make a mistake here, but I think I'm going to turn it out on my plastic 1960s era kneading board here, all measured nicely for pie crusts, which I don't like making. It's too much work, especially when you can buy really good ones in the store. So I hope you remember to take off all your rings and whatnot. It looks a little shaggy right now, but we'll get it going with a little bit more flour. And until we get it to elastic like we had it for making plain bread. So I'm kneading. I put a little bit more flour. I'm going to knead it for about 5 minutes. And when it feels right, I'm going to roll it out so that it forms roughly a rectangle. This is the point where if I continue to knead it, I can just stick it in a pan and then put it in the oven to rise and then bake. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to roll it into this rectangle, swirl it up with some nuts and brown sugar and honey. No, honey. Cinnamon and butter and brown sugar, white sugar, and some pecans. And I'll show you how to roll those up to make some pretty yummy pecan rolls. So let me work on kneading this, and I'll be back when it's done being kneaded. So as I'm kneading it, I realized I forgot to add the salt. So I'm going to just take some salt and sprinkle it on the top. And that really helps. Salt is something that just helps stuff happen when you bake. So I didn't want to have you forget the salt. So I think I'm still feeling a little bit sticky here. I want to be sure it's a little bit more elastic before I roll it into that big rectangle to try and make the cinnamon swirl rolls from this basic dough. So I think this is pretty good now. It's not sticking to me. I do have a layer of flour underneath so it's not going to stick to my counter or my little plastic thing here. And I'm going to spread it out. I have a rolling pin in case you want to use rolling pin or a wine bottle. But you want to get it roughly in a rectangle. So it's just a matter of working it and then being patient with it, because you might find you just work it to get closer to a rectangle and it just needs to take a minute. You might shrink back and just take a minute to keep moving it into a rectangular shape. It's pretty moldable, so you can guide it into being a rectangle. Square's fine, but square's a special rectangle. But just keep working this so it's out, and then wait a minute. Let it go. What you might get ready is a little bit of the melted butter. Melted butter, some ground cinnamon. Got some cinnamon powder. I use light brown sugar, dark brown sugar, I suppose. And I'm just going to sprinkle some sugar on top. And then whatever kind of nuts you want. I've got some ground nuts from New Mexico, from a farm in New Mexico, that I like to use. So I like pecan cinnamon. And this is in here, I put a half stick of butter. You know, everything's better with butter. Everything is better with butter. And I notice as I can take a little time and then stretch it out a little bit more and then let it sit and get used to being in that position, and then I'll move it again. It's all about patience. I don't want this thin. And one of the things I can do if I want it really flaky is take and put a little butter it a little bit. And then fold it. This is kind of how you can increase the flakiness. And if it sticks to this, you want to put flour on it, but it's not really sticking. You do this a bunch of times. It's how you make things, more croissant-like. I tell you, it's hard work to keep folding it and re-flattening it. But you want to get it pretty thin, and you can put rolls of, or layers of butter in there after you fold it. Butter is better. Butter is awesome. I would not use margarine with this. It doesn't cook up as nicely and nothing tastes as good. Julia Child did say that often. I always add butter. And so I'm going to do that a couple more times. Butter it, flip it, and then keep working it till it gets into a square, and then eventually work till it's a pretty flat square or rectangle. Now here I've gotten it to be a pretty good sized rectangle, maybe, I don't know, 12 inches by a little larger than 12 inches, and I'm still going to say I'm going to get it a little bit thinner. It still feels a little thick to me, so I just wanted to say you can always get it thicker, or thinner. You can always make this wider and longer, just as long as it's a rectangle. You can see it's roughly in a rectangle. It doesn't have to be exactly a rectangle. But I think thinner ends up making a really nicer spiral. So keep going, and if you think you're done, you don't think it's going more, just let it sit, let it wait, be patient with it, and let it rest, I think is the word. And then before we start adding stuff on, once you start adding in the filling that you choose to put in there, it's kind of harder to get it flat again. So here's a good size rectangle. I'm going to start by taking a little bit of the butter and spraying the butter on the whole thing. See, I like using my hands. Some people would use, some kind of paintbrush or cooking brush to do this. I just like feeling it. To me, it becomes very sensual. It's part of the experience of cooking, and just feeling it allows you to, I think, cook without necessarily measuring anything if you know how it's supposed to feel. And I'll start putting stuff on the inside. Paul likes it with apples. So you can cut up apples and put it in here, and when I do that, I don't usually bother to even peel the apples. Putting in a couple apples, I don't know, it depends on the size of the apples. Sprinkle sugar, cinnamon, some cinnamon, and because I'm from Connecticut, I always like adding a little bit of nutmeg to support my home state. I think it adds a nice flavor to your basic cinnamon rolls. And then, of course, the nuts, and you can have whatever nuts of your choosing. These are New Mexico pecans. How much am I putting on? I don't know, maybe a cup on, whatever. I'm going to spread out the pecans until they've got water. She's eating, she's not starving. And I'm going to put some brown sugar on the top as well. And this brown sugar is a little bit dry, so it's easier to spread. If it's wet, you can put it in clumps. It doesn't really matter how much. I don't know. I'm not really measuring. It's funny, I've been a math teacher my whole life, and it's kind of ironic that I don't measure. And I don't use many numbers here. It is by feel. For instance, maybe, I don't know. I watched Althea Lee of Weld, Maine, bake and cook and do this, and I think when I was little, I hung out with her mostly because I loved her to pieces, but she also let me lick the bowl and eat a little bit of sugar here and there, and that was awesome. And I think what I'm going to do is melt a little bit more butter and pour a little bit more butter on the top. I'm just thinking, so here's a little bit more butter. And I'm making sure I can touch it. If I can't touch it, then it's too hot and it'll kill the yeast. But I want to be generous with butter, generous with the sugar. I also consider my audience. If people like sugar, if it's my dad, I'll put more sugar. If it's Paul's dad, I put a little less sugar. There's the beep telling me the butter's melted. But I'm trying to channel a little Julia Child with the butter. And then here's the tricky part. Once I've got all this stuff down, I'm going to roll it. And I can either roll it from the front to the back or from the side. It doesn't really matter, but you want to just pick up one side and start turning it like so. Which is why you can see a rectangle. It's real nice. And once I have this roll, I can then cut it like so in these little pieces and put it in a pan to rise a little bit. So I've sliced this out, and I'm going to pick up each one and space them in a pan with parchment paper. And I want to be sure they're spaced out probably a little bit more than what you think, because they are going to, let me put this in the screen, they are going to rise a little bit. And you can have them rise more quickly by putting them in the oven with a pan of hot water underneath, a cool oven, an unheated oven. And that won't take long. This is on a Saturday afternoon, and I want these for Sunday morning, so I'm going to put them in the fridge, and they'll rise a little bit more slowly. But you can see how I'm spacing them in this pan.